Okay guys, so in this video I'm gonna walk you through how to authenticate or log in a user into a web application and securing your endpoint so that only users that are actually logged into your system can access your content. Now let's start with some disclaimers first and foremost. What I'm going to show you now is the bare bone basics of how authentication actually works, and security is a massive subject, and trust me, most programmers suck at this stuff. Really suck. Me included, I am no exception. It is an entire science to secure any type of application, and I urge you that if you're interested in learning more about security and so forth, go to owasp.org and read up on the best practices for different ways of securing a web application, because trust me, there's much more to this than what I'm going to be able to show you in 1 to even 10 videos. But let's get on with it. So first and foremost, let's talk about some basic security notes that I think are useful for a beginner to know about. First and foremost, always serve your website over HTTPS if it is possible. Now, I'm not going to do this in this specific situation because it's not required for us to be able to actually to do this demo example, but HTTPS is a very good thing to have on your website. It makes your content secure for users to use on insecure network connections. And then after that, never ever store passwords in plain text. I'll show you exactly how you can avoid doing this, and it's also very important because if your system is compromised, something goes wrong, something goes, a hacker gets to you, or for whatever reason your system leaks the stuff that it has in its database basically, then at least the passwords are secure so that your users aren't compromised. Because trust me, even though people shouldn't, and I am a fellow criminal when it comes to this as well, people use the same password on absolutely everything. It's a fact of the world. And then finally, if you use something like user roles, in other words, if you have, for our little demo example here, we're just going to have a user as the role of a person that's going to use your system. But you may have different types of access roles. You may have users that have the role of admin or something like that. That means that they have certain privileges other roles don't have. And these things make it a little bit more tricky to secure up your system, because some things you want a user to be able to do on your system and some things you want a admin to be able to do, and this is a little bit more of an advanced topic which we can cover in another video, but I'm not going to talk about it in this video. So let's start with what we will cover. We will talk about what a login is and what we can do, or rather how we know if a user is actually logged in, and finally how do we stop a user that is not logged in basically. And yep, that's basically it. So let's start with talking about what a login is. Let's go to a login page. I'll actually shut down these now. So here we have my web page basically, and it's running a basic web application. So this is a publicly available page. It's, in other words, something I want my users to only be to any users should be able to use this page or to visit this page without requiring a login of some sort. So if I click this logins link here, I'm actually provided with a login page in order to go into my content page. And if I do something like this, I try to access it, I'm directed to a 401 page basically, where virtually I'm not allowed to access this content because I have invalid credentials. So let's go back, and I can now register a user and access. Let's see, let's create a user. So now I'm registering a user, I'm creating a user, saving it to the database, and let's try to log in now. And as you can see here, I'm now actually I'm actually logged in. And now I can click the logout button, and now I'm logged out. So what we basically did here was that we validated that the user has the correct information, or we went to the when the login attempt is made, we go to the database, we check, do we find a user that is associated with these login credentials? If we find a user that is allowed to, or login credentials that are correct, we send the user to the page that they want to go to. If we don't find anything, we send them to the 401 page. As you can see, they're not allowed to basically go to the content that they are looking for. Now, this is something I want to touch on. So now I am logged out from the perspective of our application. This is where a lot of beginners get a little bit confused, and I'll show you why. So although if I try to do something like this and I put the incorrect information, I'm correctly sent to a 401 page and I'm not allowed to access the content. A lot of beginners mistake this this behavior for being the same thing as actually not being allowed to access something. But what happens if I do this? Ta-da! I just got to the restricted content. And this is something that it's very tricky for a lot of beginners to understand. Just because there's not a link on your page, or just because somebody is putting in information into your login form and it's not the correct information and you're sending them to a different page, that doesn't mean that they have to try. If you are not at the route level, basically on your server saying that a user has logged in, if you're not checking if a user is logged in, that doesn't stop the user from accessing your content. You need to, on the server, check if they are logged in or not. And we will look at how that looks in just a moment. So here we have our application. We have a simple server using Mongoose and Express, basically. Our model is very simple. We just have a username and a password. That's it. That's the entire user schema. I'll talk about this file in just a moment. And here we have our different static assets we saw earlier. These are just static pages that, yeah, there's nothing fancy going on here. These are the basic pages. The thing that we're interested in looking at is the application itself. So here we require Express, and we require Express session. We are going to talk about session in just a moment. Then we have a path, something called bcrypt. We'll talk about that as well. Body parser to parse the incoming request. Basically, body parser is the way that we parse the form information. So when the user inputs their login information or their registration information, that's the way we know, or rather how we get that information from the request that is coming to the server. We have some is logged in middleware. Here we'll talk about that in just a moment. A user model, and here we instantiate the application. We'll talk about salt rounds in just a moment. And here we have a little convenience function that all it does is basically it takes a file name and knows. It basically helps me to just get these files into the response that I'm going to send out. We'll talk about all of this in just a moment. And here we have the stat. Basically, this is where we declare Express. We tell Express get the static files from the public directory here. So when we ask for the main CSS file, this is where it's going to go and look. And here we can see if we go to the root, we get the index.html page, which was that landing page we saw first, the one that doesn't have any restrictions. And if we go to /login, we send the login HTML page. We'll talk about all of this logic in just a moment. This is the post to the post endpoint for the login. So this is where we're sending our login information and try to log in, basically. Then we have a register endpoint so that we get the registration form. And the same thing goes here. Register and login both have their own post endpoint. And finally, we have our /welcome endpoint. This is the one that's going to be restricted. We'll talk about this in just a moment. Finally, down here we have a /401 page, which is going to show us that 401 page. And finally, there's a logout endpoint as well. So this is our entire application. So let's take a look at the login here first and foremost. So when we post our login information, what's going to happen is that we are going to look at the body and we're going to grab the username and the password from the body, and then we're going to go to the use the user module or the user model, and find a user that has a username that matches the username that we got from the client. If we find that user, we're going to do this. This is where bcrypt comes into play. You remember I was saying that you should at no point ever store a user's password in plain text. You always encrypt passwords. And what's beautiful about this is some beginners will think, well, but how do I know if the password is the same password? Well, if you think about it, if you hash a password, in other words, you convert it into something that doesn't make sense to anybody, not even you, that's not a problem, because you shouldn't know what your user's password is to begin with. All you care about is that you can check if the password is the correct password. And if you have saved a encrypted password in the database and you run that password through the same encryption algorithm, or rather the plain text of that password through the same encryption, then the string that's the encryption or the hash that is going to be produced on the other side is going to be the same. And that's all you want. You just want to be able to know if it's the same password, and that's the way you do that. So what's happening here is that you're using a secure encryption algorithm such as bcrypt. This is an entire science. Some encryption algorithms are very bad and some are better. Bcrypt is the one that I use, and I think it's fairly well established. So you do a comparison on the password. So basically this is the plain text password that is coming from the client. And this is the hashed, the encrypted password that we have stored in our database. We'll look at the registration in just a moment and you'll see how this encryption actually works. But that's where this library comes in. So it allows us to compare the plain text password to the encrypted password and tell if it's the same password. It's very, very useful. And then we check, okay, is correct password? If it is, then we go to our session and we put the user's ID onto the session's user ID property. Now, let's talk about sessions. So a session is a way for you to store information on the server about the user. A session is extremely common in traditional web applications when, say that you may have been, let's say that you bought something online. You go to a web shop of some sort, you start adding items into your cart, and then you go to the purchase page and something goes down with the page or something doesn't really work and you have to refresh the page and all your stuff is still in your cart. That's because the server has stored, or the server uses a session to verify that it allows it to store information while you are using the system over several pages, because you may know that HTTP and it's a stateless communication protocol, which means that the server, all it really does is that it keeps a little reference to something that it wants to remember about you for the duration of the time, for some arbitrary duration. It can be for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, for several days, or until you log out and so forth. All you really have to know about sessions for right now is that it's the way that traditionally you determine whether or not somebody is logged in or logged out. And the beauty about this is that it's actually very, very simple. All you need to do is to somehow communicate to the server that this user has passed the validation. In other words, it's logged in. And this is what's happening right here. Because if I go to a user session, in our application, we're starting the session as soon as the user comes to our first web page. And I'll show you exactly how that works in just a moment. But what happens is that when we want to check if a user has been logged in, yes or no, we go to the session object like this and we check if the user ID is there. If there's no user ID, then we know that they never passed this step. They've never logged in. So we can send them to the 401 page or the login page very easily. And if there is something here, if the user ID is set, if they pass this, well, then we know they're logged in. Easy peasy. Very, very, it's very elegant and simple for a smaller web page. And then finally we redirect them to the welcome endpoint So they go into the welcome part of our application. And if any of this fails, we send them to the 401 page. Now let's look at the registration. So it's very similar. We see that we grab the username and the password in the registration form, and then we use bcrypt in order to, and with the hashing function, and we take the plain password, the text that we got from the client, and this is where the salt rounds come in. It's just an arbitrary number, and basically I'm not going to go too deep into what salt is, but think of it as a way to determine how many times are we going to hash this password, how difficult do we try to make, or how powerful and inclusive do we try to make this hash that we're creating. And that's virtually it. Think of it as a way of saying, okay, make this a very strong hash, or make it, as a weaker hash, whatever. There's like hashing and so forth. That's an entire science in of itself, and I'm not going to go too deep into it. But for now, that's going to be a good enough explanation. All right, so here we then create the new user with the username and the encrypted password. Finally, we save the user, and then we redirect the user to the login page, and there we have our user. Now, you may have noticed earlier that when I went to and clicked logout, went to login, or rather, let's just do this, and I could even though I clicked the logout button, I could still click welcome, or just go directly to the welcome endpoint. How's that working? Let's look at the logout. What's happening here? So we go to the /logout endpoint, and we call the destroy function on our session here, which means that now the session for this user is actually, it's not longer there anymore. So we are being logged out correctly. There's no session anymore, and therefore there's not going to be a user ID property on the session object. But what's happening here is virtually that we are not actually validating. If we look at this function here, you can see that I was saying that we're going to touch on this in just a moment. We are not if conditioning, we are not checking, or there's no check here. I said earlier that the way that we wanted to check, let's see this, for example, require session.user. This is the check we really want to do. Like because if the user ID is not, if the session's user ID is not undefined, then the user is logged in. But if it is undefined, then the user is not logged in. And that's where this middleware I showed you, I was talking about earlier, comes into play. If I now do this, and I save that, let's see if I can do something like that, make it a little bit nicer. And let's restart my node server. Refresh the page. Let's go to login and do this. Bam. Now all of a sudden I correctly, as I expect, go to the 401 page, even though I didn't try to log in. Just try to directly go to that page that I'm not allowed to visit if I'm not logged in. And if I do this, it works exactly as before. And I can refresh this page over and over, and I'm still logged in. And I click log out. I do welcome. Oh, not welcome. And I'm still being redirected to the 401 page. Perfect. This is exactly what we're expecting. So let's look at this middleware. So here we have, and it's just a function, and all it does is it does exactly what I said. Or a very similar thing. It checks if the user ID is on the session, and if it is, we let the request through. Otherwise, we redirect the request to 401. Now, why am I doing this? Why am I not just putting that logic inside of this function here? Well, the reason why middlewares are so powerful, and this is a very common middleware, is because I want to be able to restrict. If I start adding other endpoints like this, so let's say I have a second endpoint, I just want to be able to include this restriction on any route whenever I want to. I don't want to have to like duplicate all my logic inside of the controller handler in this function here. So having something like an isLoggedIn middleware is actually very, very common, and I encourage you to use middleware as often as possible when it comes to doing these sorts of validations. Now, finally, we said that we were going to define what a login is, and we have defined that. And we have also said define what a session is, so that we know how a user is logged in. And we've also talked about how do we stop a user from being logged in. That's what we're using this isLoggedIn middleware for. So by simply knowing that there's a session and that there is a user ID on that session, we can check if a user is logged in or logged out, and we can actually stop them and redirect them to this 401 page if they're trying to access something that we don't want them to access. But I want to show you one final thing that is important, because you may ask the question, but how, Frederick, how does a session actually know what the user is all about? Like, how do we know what the user is actually do? Like, how is a session even working? Let's look at that. So here we are at my Chrome tools. Let's take a look at applications. You may have heard the term cookies before, and this is a perfect example to get you introduced to session cookies. So this is a session cookie, and this is what happens when, if I remove this and I go to my login page, do you see that there's a new session cookie now? I can remove it again, refresh, and there's another session cookie. So what's happening is that our server is setting a very specific type of cookie that is called a session cookie on my browser. And this ID here identifies my browser to my server. So this is how my server knows that I have a session and what session that is. That's this string right here. Now, this is very important, because, and this is the way that you actually are logged out in general, or rather, not that you're being logged out, but this is the way you can actually log yourself out if you're ever stuck in a session. You can actually do something like foo-bar, I get logged in, and now my server, basically when I made the request, I included this magical little string here in my request to the server, so the server saw, all right, cool, this is the session that is associated with this ID. I'll put the user ID that we saw earlier onto this specific session and just save that on the server. Now, I'm logged in now, so I can refresh this over and over. But if I remove this, boom, now I'm on the 401 page because I removed my session. So when we went to the server again, the server couldn't find this ID in the session, and so it just said, all right, I can't find anybody that is associated with this logged in session, so I'll just send them to the 401 page. And that's actually how easy it is to work with sessions. And yeah, that's I think we've covered the bare bone basics of how sessions work and like all of this stuff. I'll just very briefly show you where all of that sessions nonsense was coming from. So this is very specific to Express, but I want you to know that the stuff that I've shown you right now, this is very generic. This is the way it works almost in every single programming language. Sessions are not specific to Node or JavaScript. These things are in every single web. These are a standard. It's just different ways of doing it. So here, as we can see, I'm declaring a session with a secret and some configurations, and this is where all of that stuff is coming from, basically. And yeah, hopefully you found all of this useful, and if you have any more questions, please post a comment and I'll have a look. Have a great day.